The dust of Redemption Gulch settled in a fine brown film on everything, coating the raw timber of the saloon, the warped planks of the boardwalk, and the soul of any man who stayed too long. Reese stood apart from it all, a man carved from the mountain granite he called home. He was immense, a wall of muscle and sinew packed onto a frame that dwarfed the townsfolk who gave him a wide berth. His hair and beard, the color of dark, wet earth, fell untamed past his shoulders, and his eyes held the patient, assessing look of a predator. He was here for a transaction, one he'd put off for 2 lonely years. The advertisement had promised a sturdy, plain woman of good character, suited to the rigors of frontier life. He expected someone with calloused hands and a stoic gaze, a partner in survival, not sentiment. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of leather and wood, groaned to a halt in a cloud of its own making. The door swung open. First, a polished leather boot, impossibly small. Then, a cascade of crimson silk. The woman who emerged was not sturdy or plain. She was a slash of vibrant color in a world of brown and gray, a living flame against the bleached backdrop of the town. Her black hair was a lacquered sculpture of pins and coils, her face a perfect oval of pale jade. She wore a dress of such exquisite cut and fiery red that it seemed to suck the very light from the sun-scorched street. She held a single scuffed suitcase in a delicate hand, her posture as straight and unyielding as a spear. A collective breath was held by the onlookers. Whispers slithered through the crowd. Reese felt a low, guttural sound rumble in his chest. His carefully constructed world, a quiet fortress of grief and solitude, tilted on its axis. He looked at the paper in his hand, the signed agreement, then back at the impossible vision standing by the stagecoach. Her eyes, dark and impossibly deep, scanned the hostile faces and landed on him, the biggest, most intimidating man in the entire dusty panorama. A flicker of something, not fear, but a weary resignation passed through them. He took a half-step forward, his own disbelief a thick knot in his throat. He spoke to no one, the words a rough whisper of gravel and shock. "That can't be my bride." The journey from the town into the jagged teeth of the mountains was a silent battle. Reese led the way, his pack mule laden with their supplies, the small suitcase strapped precariously on top. The woman, Lynn, she had said her name was, the word a soft chime in the harsh air, followed behind. The crimson dress, a beacon of defiance in the dusty street, was now a liability. The fine silk caught on sagebrush and snagged on the sharp edges of rocks, creating small, whispering tears. The hem was already dark with dirt and grime. She moved with a strange, fluid grace that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance, her steps careful but sure. She never stumbled, but her breath came in quiet, controlled puffs. Reese didn't offer to help. This was the first test. His mountain demanded strength, and pity was a luxury it never afforded. He walked with a ground-eating stride, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions and simmering resentment. He felt like a fool. This was not a woman suited for his life. She was a porcelain doll, a hothouse flower destined to wither and break against the unforgiving reality of his existence. He could hear the snickers of the men back in town, imagine the stories they were already telling. The giant mountain man and his little China doll bride. He gritted his teeth, his anger a hot coal in his gut. Yet, as the sun climbed higher, beating down with a merciless intensity, he found himself glancing back more often. She never complained, not once. When they stopped to water the mule at a thin trickle of a stream, she knelt with an innate elegance, cupping water in her hands to drink, her face unreadable. He watched the methodical way she repinned a loose strand of her intricate hair, her movements economical and precise. There was a discipline in her, a steel core hidden beneath the silk. He had seen that look before, in cornered animals and desperate men, a will to endure that had nothing to do with physical size. He tore a strip of jerky with his teeth, the salty meat doing nothing to ease the dryness in his throat. He held a piece out to her. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of placid composure slipped, revealing a flicker of raw exhaustion. She took the jerky, her fingers brushing his calloused palm, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The silence resumed as they walked on, but something had shifted. It was no longer just anger and judgment. It was a seed of unwilling curiosity. The cabin was nestled in a high meadow, a solitary structure of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. It was more fortress than home, built to withstand the crushing weight of winter snow and the lonesome howl of the wind. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of life for 100 miles. When they finally broke through the tree line and the meadow opened before them, Lynn stopped dead. Her gaze swept over the small, rugged cabin, the towering pines that crowded its edges, and the vast, empty sky above. This was it, the end of the line, the wild, untamable edge of the world she had run to. Reese watched her face, searching for the revulsion he expected. Instead, he saw that same weary resignation from the stagecoach, but this time it was deeper, heavier. He unstrapped her suitcase from the mule and set it on the ground beside her. The sound was a dull thud of finality. "This is it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't know what else to say. He pushed open the heavy plank door, revealing the Spartan interior. There was one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall. A large, scarred table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a bed built into the far corner covered with thick furs. It was brutally simple, but it was meticulously clean. The floor was swept, the pots hanging by the fire were scrubbed, and there was a profound sense of order in the starkness. It spoke of a man who fought against chaos both outside and within. Lynn stepped over the threshold, her torn red dress a stark, painful contrast to the muted browns and grays of the room. She ran a hand over the rough wood of the table, her touch light, exploratory. She was taking it all in, assessing her new prison. That night, the space between them felt both immense and suffocating. He cooked a stew of salted pork and beans, and they ate in silence. The only sounds the clink of spoons against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. When it was time to sleep, he pointed to the bed. "You take it." He didn't wait for an answer, simply taking a spare blanket and settling himself on the floor by the hearth, turning his back to her. He lay awake for hours, listening to the alien sound of another person's breathing in his sanctuary. He was a man who had mastered solitude, and her presence was a stone dropped into the still pool of his life, the ripples spreading into every dark corner. A silent rhythm began to form between them, a language spoken not in words but in work. The days fell into a pattern dictated by the sun and the endless needs of survival. Reese would rise before dawn, his massive frame moving with a quiet efficiency that ceased to surprise her. He would be gone for hours, hunting or checking his trap lines, returning with game slung over his shoulder. Lynn, in turn, claimed the domestic space of the cabin. She had traded the ruined cheongsam for a spare set of his clothes, the shirt hanging off her small frame like a canvas tent, the trousers cinched tight with a piece of rope. The sight was so incongruous it should have been comical, yet on her it looked strangely determined. She learned the quirks of his cast-iron stove, coaxing bread to rise and stews to simmer. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin where a few hardy herbs still struggled for life. With a focus that bordered on obsession, she began to tend to it, her delicate hands clearing weeds and turning the soil with a sharpened stick. It was grueling work, but she attacked it with a quiet ferocity. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language and culture was too wide, and Reese was a man who used words like currency, spending them only when absolutely necessary. Yet they communicated. A nod from him when he tasted her cooking was high praise. The way she left a bucket of hot water for him near the fire after he returned, caked in mud and sweat, was an act of quiet care. He started leaving wildflowers on the table for her, clumps of purple lupine and fiery Indian paintbrush he found in the high meadows. He would never acknowledge leaving them, and she would never acknowledge receiving them, but they would appear in a tin can of water, a small spot of beauty in the harsh cabin. One afternoon he watched her from the edge of the trees as she worked in her small garden. Her face was smudged with dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was humming a tune, a soft, melancholic melody that drifted on the thin mountain air. It was a sound so achingly sad and beautiful that it made his chest tighten. He saw the way she would sometimes pause and stare out at the distant peaks, her eyes holding a deep, haunting sorrow. He began to understand that her steel wasn't just resilience. It was a cage built around a profound wound. She was not just a displaced woman. She was a haunted one. The summer sky, which had been a sheet of brilliant, unforgiving blue for weeks, began to curdle. By midday, the clouds had turned a bruised purple gray, stacking up against the western peaks like a gathering army. Reese came back early, his face grim as he scanned the horizon. He carried an armload of firewood, which he stacked high beside the hearth. He checked the shutters, securing the leather hinges, his movements economical and grim. He said only one word to her: "Storm." Lynn watched him, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She had seen rain, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt different, charged with a primal electric tension. The first clap of thunder was not a distant rumble, but a violent physical crack that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. The cabin shuddered. Lynn flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. As the storm broke its fury upon them, the world outside dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 fists, and lightning bleached the room white for a split second, followed by thunder that shook the very logs of the walls. With each concussive blast, Lynn grew smaller. The steel spine she had shown for weeks seemed to melt away, replaced by a raw, visceral terror. She retreated to the furthest corner of the cabin, away from the single window, wrapping her arms around her knees and tucking her head down. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from a fear so deep it seemed to come from her very soul. Reese saw it all. He stopped his work, his large frame a study in stillness. He had seen fear in all its forms, the fear of a cornered bear, the fear of a starving winter, the fear of a lonely death. This was different. This was the terror of a past trauma, a memory being violently replayed by the storm's assault. He didn't speak, knowing words would be useless against such a force. Instead, he moved the heavy table aside and sat on the floor, his back against the opposite wall, facing her. He simply sat, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man, his presence a quiet anchor in the roaring chaos. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He offered his solidity. He was there, a guardian in the dark, and he would not let the storm or anything else touch her. Hours passed. The storm raged, and Lynn trembled, and Reese sat watch, his patient gaze never leaving her. When the thunder finally subsided, replaced by the steady drumming of rain, she slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale and tear-streaked in the dim firelight. Her eyes met his across the room, and in them he saw not just fear, but a flicker of fragile, dawning trust. 2 weeks after the storm, a stranger rode up the mountain path. Reese saw him long before he reached the clearing. A lone rider moving with the easy confidence of a man who was paid to be comfortable in the saddle. He was not a prospector. His clothes were too clean, his horse too fine. Reese met him outside the cabin, his hand resting casually on the axe handle leaning against the doorframe. The man was young, with a lean face and eyes that were constantly moving, taking everything in. He smiled, a thin, practiced expression. "Lost my way," the rider said, his voice smooth. "Looking for the pass down to Willow Creek. Name's Devlin." Reese didn't move. His gaze was flat and cold. "No pass this way. You're a long way from any creek." He watched the man's eyes flick towards the cabin door, where a shadow of movement had appeared. It was Lynn. She had been inside kneading dough and had come to the doorway, her hands white with flour. The moment she saw Devlin, she went utterly still. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a stark porcelain white. It was a reaction of pure, unadulterated terror, a fear far greater than any storm could conjure. She backed away from the door, melting into the shadows of the cabin as if she had never been there. But Devlin had seen her. A flicker of recognition and something like satisfaction crossed his face before he masked it. Reese saw it all, the stranger's lie, the practiced smile, and Lynn's soul-deep panic. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threat. "There's nothing for you here," Reese said, his voice a low growl. He took a half step forward, and the sheer size of him seemed to blot out the sun. For the first time, Devlin's smile faltered. He looked from Reese's granite-hard face to the dark doorway and back again. He gave a curt nod, reining his horse around. "Much obliged," he said, the words clipped. He rode away without looking back. Reese stood there until the rider was swallowed by the trees, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into silence. The quiet that descended on the meadow was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. He turned and went back inside. Lynn was standing by the cold hearth, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The flour was gone, wiped clean. "You know him," Reese stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, a jerky, mechanical movement. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a ragged whisper, her English fractured by fear but terribly clear. "He is not lost. He was looking for me." That night, the carefully constructed silence between them shattered. The fire cast long, dancing shadows that turned the small cabin into a cavern of secrets. Lynn sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea she wasn't drinking. The composure she had worn like armor for weeks was gone, leaving her exposed and fragile. Reese leaned against the stone mantelpiece, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his presence filling the room. He waited. He knew she had to offer the story. He would not demand it. Finally, she began to speak, her voice low and halting. She was not a mail-order bride. Her name was Lynn Way, and she was the daughter of a merchant in San Francisco, a merchant who had fallen into a deep, insurmountable debt to a man named Alistair Finch. Finch was a man who built railroads and crushed lives with equal indifference, a man who collected beautiful things, and he had decided to collect her. "He did not want a wife," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dark liquid in her cup. "He wanted a bird in a cage, a pretty thing to own." Her father, shamed and broken, had agreed to the arrangement, but Lynn had refused to be sold. With the help of a loyal servant, she had found a way out, an escape. The mail-order bride agency was a desperate last-minute deception, a name and a ticket bought from a poor woman who had changed her mind. She chose the most remote contract she could find, a man living so deep in the wilderness she prayed no one would ever find her. She chose him, a quiet mountain man with no connections, a ghost on the edge of the map. "I did not come here to be your wife," she said, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. They were filled with a terrible, pleading honesty. "I came here to disappear. I am sorry for the lie." Reese listened without moving, the firelight carving harsh lines into his face. The pieces all clicked into place. The red dress, the terror, the steel will. She wasn't running to a new life. She was running from an old death. He looked at this small, fierce woman who had endured his wilderness without complaint, who had faced down her own ghosts in his cabin. The paper contract he'd signed was meaningless. The reality of the woman sitting before him was not. He pushed himself off the mantel and walked to the cabin door. He slid the heavy iron bolt into place, the sound echoing with finality in the small room. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable, but his voice absolute. "Finch's world ends at the tree line. This is my land. He's not welcome here." And in that moment, he was no longer just a man she was hiding with. He was her protector. The attack did not come with a thunderous charge. It began with a chilling subtlety. 2 days after Devlin's visit, Reese found tracks at the edge of the clearing. 3 sets of prints, men who knew how to move quietly through the woods. They were being watched. The vast open wilderness that had been Lynn's shield now became the walls of their prison. The men didn't show themselves. They were a ghost-like presence at the edge of the trees, a flicker of movement in the periphery, a single, sharp whistle on the wind that wasn't a bird. It was a siege of nerves designed to wear them down, to make them crack. Finch's strategy was cruel and patient. He wanted Lynn not just returned, but broken. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that was almost a physical force. Every creak of the logs, every rustle of leaves outside was a potential threat. Sleep came in brief, fitful bursts. Reese moved with a coiled, deadly calm. He barricaded the single window with the heavy table, leaving only a small slit to see through. He checked his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was a sentry, a guardian at the gate. Lynn, in turn, found her own purpose. She was not a warrior, but she was intelligent. She rationed their food and water with meticulous care, her mind sharp and clear despite the fear that hummed constantly beneath her skin. She became his second set of eyes, watching the parts of the clearing he could not, her gaze sharp and focused. The dynamic between them had been forged anew in the crucible of this threat. They were a unit, moving in unspoken coordination. He would stand guard while she slept, and she would have coffee hot and ready for him when he finally rested. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, they sat in the growing dark, the fire banked low to avoid giving a target. "Why?" Lynn asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this? I am not your wife. I deceived you." Reese stared into the dimness, his profile a rugged silhouette. He thought of the quiet grave on the other side of the meadow, the one marked with a simple wooden cross. He thought of the crushing loneliness that had hollowed him out for years. He thought of the wildflowers she placed in the tin can. "I made a bargain," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and I keep my bargains." It was more than that, and they both knew it. This was not about a contract. It was about the fierce, protective instinct she had awakened in him, a feeling he thought had died long ago. It was about one solitary soul recognizing another. In the deepening shadows, he reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the table. It was the first time he had touched her with intentional tenderness. Her fingers curled around his, a silent acceptance, a bond sealed in the face of the coming dark. The rain began just after midnight, a soft, whispering drizzle that quickly intensified into a torrential downpour. It was the chance Reese had been waiting for. The storm that had once terrified Lynn was now their salvation, a cloak of noise and darkness to cover their escape. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low but urgent in the small cabin. "Now." There was no time for packing, no room for sentiment. He grabbed his rifle, a pouch of ammunition, and a small satchel of dried meat and hardtack. He slung a water skin over his shoulder. He looked at Lynn, who stood ready, her face pale but resolute in the flickering lamplight. Her borrowed clothes were practical, her hair tied back simply. The porcelain doll was gone, replaced by a survivor. He moved to the back of the cabin to a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest. With a grunt of effort he pulled, and a small, cleverly hidden panel of logs swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. It led directly into the dense forest behind the cabin. As a final act, he kicked a flaming log from the hearth onto the floorboards. Flames licked up the dry wood almost instantly. "It's a distraction," he explained, grabbing her hand. "They'll see the fire, think we're trapped inside." They slipped out into the churning, rain-soaked night. The forest was a disorienting maze of black trunks and lashing branches. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and slick roots. But this was Reese's world. He moved through it with an unerring instinct, his large hand a firm, guiding presence on Lynn's arm, pulling her along in his wake. The pursuit was immediate. Shouts erupted from the front of the cabin as the fire grew, painting the night sky with a hellish orange glow. They heard the men crashing through the undergrowth behind them, their progress clumsy and loud compared to Reese's silent passage. They scrambled up a steep, rocky incline, the rain plastering their hair to their faces and turning the climb into a life-or-death struggle. Near the top, Lynn's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. She cried out, a small, sharp sound that was nearly swallowed by the storm as she slid backward. Before she could fall, Reese's arm snaked around her waist, his strength unyielding. He hauled her up against his chest, holding her for a moment, their breath mingling in the cold air. "I have you," he breathed, the words a fierce promise against her ear. They pushed on, deeper and higher into the unforgiving high country, the sounds of their hunters growing fainter behind them, swallowed by the storm and the vast, indifferent wilderness. They traveled for 2 days, moving through a landscape of brutal beauty, jagged peaks, deep ravines, and forests so thick the sun was a distant memory. They were exhausted, bruised, and perpetually damp, but they were alive. Reese pushed them onward relentlessly, his knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. He knew every game trail, every hidden spring, every natural shelter the mountains offered. He led them not away from their pursuers, but towards a place of his own choosing, a narrow box canyon known to the old trappers as the Needle's Eye. It was a natural trap, with sheer rock walls and only one way in or out. He was no longer running, he was hunting. They set their ambush near the canyon's entrance, hiding in a cluster of massive boulders that overlooked the trail. From their vantage point, they watched as 3 figures appeared below, moving cautiously into the canyon. It was Devlin and 2 other men, their faces hard and grim. "Stay here," Reese commanded Lynn, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "No matter what happens." He moved from their hiding place with the silence of a cougar, circling around to block the canyon's exit. The confrontation was swift and savage. Reese emerged from the shadows, a primal force of nature, his size and fury overwhelming. The first man went down before he could even raise his rifle. The second turned to fight, but he was no match for Reese's raw strength. The canyon echoed with the brutal sounds of the struggle. Lynn watched, her heart pounding against her ribs, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She saw it all, Reese's fight not for land or pride, but for her. Devlin stood apart, his pistol drawn but not aimed. He watched the brutal ballet of violence, his face a mask of conflict. He had been sent to retrieve property, a piece of human chattel, but he had seen the look in Lynn's eyes at the cabin, and he saw the fierce protective devotion in the mountain man's fight. This wasn't business. It was something far more elemental. As Reese subdued the second man, he turned his bloody and bruised face towards Devlin. The 2 men stared at each other down the length of the canyon. Devlin could have ended it. He could have raised his pistol and fired. Instead, After a long, tense moment, he slowly lowered his weapon. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, turned, and walked away, leaving his companions and his mission behind. The threat was over. The canyon fell silent, save for the whisper of the wind. Reese stood, breathing heavily, his body battered but unbroken. He looked up at the rocks where Lynn was hidden. She emerged slowly, her eyes wide, and ran down the slope towards him. She didn't say a word. She simply threw her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his chest, her small frame trembling against his. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, a silent vow of protection given and received. In the quiet of the canyon, surrounded by the wreckage of their past, they began to build their future.